so we're moving topic now from online delivery to something equally important, which is feedback to students, which remains very important. So today we're going to be telling you about the outcomes from our most recent study, feedback, which centered on allowing students to specify individual feedback themes. So, sorry, my slide changing isn't working. Oh, there we go. Okay, so just to give you some context, this is actually where we did our teaching before coronavirus, which is the Teaching and Learning Centre at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. We teach postgraduate students, so our current class of 52 includes 34 international students who are from all around the world. So we have quite a broad class. Okay, so what we're going to present to you today, I'll just give you an introduction to what we were doing. My colleagues are going to present the results, and we have one of our students, James, who's going to tell you a bit more about the student perspective on all this. So in terms of feedback, if we think about what students think, in things like the Postgraduate Taught Experience Survey last year, in terms of whether feedback on their work was useful and the numbers agreeing with that statement, in the University of Glasgow overall, we have 71%, medicine overall 77%. We actually scored 90%, but even though that figure sounds pretty good, the question is, why isn't that 100%? Why don't 100% of students think our feedback is useful? So there's a number of possible reasons. One is that in our feedback, we are not addressing the concerns of the particular student. In terms of getting feedback on a previous report and then trying to do something different, it might be that in our next feedback, we haven't actually addressed what the student was trying to improve. So we haven't helped them close the feedback loop. And anonymous marking, which we're all using, doesn't actually help us much there because we don't know whose report it is that we're marking. So we can't help close that feedback loop. So the idea of the current study was actually to ask students to identify specific areas on which they would like to receive feedback. So what we did this year, report 1, students just received feedback in the usual way. And this is the kind of form we used where they get strengths, they get key areas and points to improve upon. But then with submission of report 2, the students were asked to identify one aspect of report 2 that they wanted specific feedback on. When they got report 2 back, they received feedback on that aspect. And you see this at the top of the feedback sheet, but then they still got something on their strengths and general key areas and points to improve upon. So they still got some general feedback as well. So after this whole process was completed, we asked students to complete a questionnaire. And then after analysis of that questionnaire, we invited students to take part in focus groups. Here's the questionnaire that we used. It's quite a brief questionnaire. I'm actually going to pass you on to Saida, who is going to talk about the feedback requests that we got, because it was actually quite interesting.
Okay, so after receiving feedback from the first report, for the subsequent assignment, students were asked to select a specific area which they wanted more feedback on. And these here are just some examples of thoughtful requests for feedback that we actually received. So you'll see that these examples are quite detailed. The student here in example 1 is asking for feedback specifically on the comparison of techniques and whether they had discussed the issues currently faced by molecular testing. Now in the second example, the feedback is relating to the effective use of diagrams and whether they have conveyed their understanding of a specific technique. And in this third example, the student has requested feedback on their use of figures and tables and whether they have included the relevant information. So you can see from these 3 examples for requests that these have been well thought through, and the first 2 refer to previous work or feedback. On the other hand, these are 3 examples for feedback, which you can see are brief and generalised. So these examples haven't detailed what the student wants. They simply say conclusion, key areas and points to improve on, which is a subheading on one of our standard feedback performers, and then data interpretation. So clearly there is a big difference in depth of what the students are actually asking for. In this slide, we then compare the amount of detail in feedback requests with the grade each student received for their work. This analysis is for all 52 students. 15 out of the 52 had a detailed request, and the remaining 37 had less detailed or vague requests. In three cases, there was no requests. So those with the detailed requests scored more highly on the assignments. Interestingly, when offered the chance to request specific feedback for report 3, which was for only 43 students, only 6 of the 43 made specific feedback requests for report 3. And this will be touched on again by Leah and James. So now I will pass you on to Gerhard, who will discuss the results.
I think Gerhard needs to be unmuted.
I am unmuted now,
Yeah.
aren't I? Yes. Okay. I am going to discuss a few results from this questionnaire. The first 2 questions were about the students' how they felt about the usefulness of the feedback. So on the left-hand side, you see the answers with respect to marker-determined feedback. So how well did they think the marker feedback helped them? And it's quite pleasing to see that 90% of the students who replied here did feel that the marker-determined feedback was extremely or very useful. Only 10% weren't that impressed with this feedback. I should maybe say at this point that the questionnaire was sent to 52 students and we had a reply of 30 students. That's just under 60%, which I think is a reasonable response rate. On the right-hand side, you now see what the students thought about the student requested feedback. Still, over 70% of the students felt that this was useful, but a larger number found that feedback less useful than the marker-determined feedback. I'm not quite sure what this really means, but maybe they felt that we know better than them themselves what they really needed. The next question, Maria, all right, there it is. The next question was asking about their interest. Did the student requested feedback improve their interest in the process, in the assignment? And 2/3 of the class actually thought that their interest was improved by this process, and 1/3 of the class didn't think that it made a difference. So that's actually quite a good result, because anything that improves a student interest can only be a good thing as long as it doesn't make their interest worse. So next question was about student requested feedback. Has it helped the development of writing skills? Again, gratifyingly, over 60% thought that this helped them in improving their writing skills, but a small number didn't think that it was helpful. It is quite an important question, I think, for us, is what can we do to capture those few who didn't find the feedback helpful or who didn't think that this helps their writing skills. There were 2 questions on the questionnaire which were free text questions, which asked for either particularly valuable aspects of this requesting feedback process or about not valuable or difficult aspects. I've picked out 2 different students' responses. So this first student thought that it was beneficial that one could ask for feedback about an aspect that they were struggling with, and that one could then get specific feedback how to improve that one aspect. This is precisely what we thought this process would allow students to do. And this particular student didn't really think that there was any problem or any not valuable aspect of that whole thing. They obviously felt that everyone would have something that they felt could be better. Here's an example from a different student. Now, this is an example for a number of students who thought and reported that they found it difficult to decide what aspect they wanted feedback on. Now, in this case, the student clearly was somewhat confused by the previous feedback, but it was clear from some other responses from students that they just didn't know what to ask for. Now, this particular student actually in the question about valuable aspects did realize that if one knew where one could improve, then this question of this ability to ask for specific feedback is a good thing. So I'll pass on to Leah now.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk briefly about the focus groups that we ran after the questionnaires to tease out a bit more about the themes and ideas. And I want to talk about 3 key themes that came out of the focus groups with the 5 students who participated. So the first theme then that we really came across quite strongly in these focus groups was that some students perhaps felt that by asking for focused feedback, they were potentially missing out on the more general feedback that they would have received. And to us as educators, that's really interesting, because I suppose it didn't really cross our minds that students would think we would give them focused feedback instead of the general feedback. It's supposed to be in addition to it. One student said, I didn't ask for feedback the second time the option was presented because I wanted a more general feedback that touched on everything. So that perhaps reflects this 6 out of the whole class that only 6 wanted feedback the second time we offered it specific feedback, because they felt they weren't going to get the more general feedback. Somebody else said, it did kind of make me worry that I wasn't getting all of the feedback I would have gotten originally because it was so focused. So they weren't perceiving it as something that was an additional thing, but it was almost as though it was instead. However, not all students thought that. One student said it had the general feedback as well as the feedback I requested. It did not totally rely on the specific feedback I asked. And that's what we were anticipating all students would have felt. That would have been their experience. But interestingly, it wasn't necessarily what everybody felt. So the second theme, some students seemed to worry that it might have an effect on their grading, that we were drawn to their weaknesses by them requesting feedback, which again was quite an interesting thing to come out. Not all students felt this. Some students said, for example, whenever I'm writing my report, I'm very well aware of what my strengths are and what my weaknesses are. And another student said, usually things that I'm aware of that's not my strengths, this would be what I would be asking for feedback on. So some of them clearly felt that they knew their own strengths and weaknesses, and whether or not those ones felt that they were drawing our attention to their weaknesses, it was a wee bit unclear, but others of them definitely felt that it could have an effect on their grading. One of them said, if there was a way to have the person that's looking at the specific feedback not be the person who's assigning the mark, that way you could give the specific feedback, but it's not a concern that pointing it out will make it so that your grade will be affected. So there's definitely an anxiety coming across that by drawing our attention to their weaknesses, we may mark their report more harshly. And again, that wasn't something we had anticipated. So being able to tease this out in the focus group might help us to reassure students if we use this approach in the future. The third theme was possibly a more positive kind of theme that came out of the focus group, and that was some feedback in the background of somebody. It was that the students really appreciated getting both personalised and specific feedback. So one student said the most helpful feedback is the one that makes suggestions, places to improve. I struggled a bit with generalised comments like this could be improved, and we don't often feel that we put generalised comments. We always try to be very specific with our feedback. But clearly the specific nature on points to improve on is something that they appreciate. Somebody else suggested it would be advisable to have one evaluator for the evaluation of all the reports on one individual. That way the student would know that they're improving, as well as the faculty member would also know, rather than it being anonymous. And I quite like that comment. I found it interesting because I think it tells me a bit about the idea that students want to develop this relationship with their educators, and they want something that is more of a dialogue almost than just simply marks on a sheet of paper, but they want to be seen to be improving and they want to feel they're improving. So hopefully this approach that we used was something that could impact on that. So I'm going to pass on finally then to James, who's one of our current students, who's going to tell us a bit more about the student experience of this whole process of feedback.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal experience of the specific feedback, as well as what I've heard from other students as well. So initially, my understanding of the process was that we were to identify one aspect for targeted feedback. That could have been an area that we felt was weaker and that we wanted to improve on, or it could have been something in response to suggestions or advice given in previous feedback from other reports. And my understanding as well was that once the report was submitted, we would receive both the targeted feedback and general feedback, which would cover the report as a whole as well. So we did see a number of advantages to being able to request specific feedback. So it is a valuable opportunity to enhance our learning while focusing on the area that we personally wanted to improve on. That sort of thing does add value to the degree, a lot of us felt. So it's not the sort of thing you can get from a textbook, for example. For me, it did also help to engage more with the report while I was working on it, and it motivated me to work harder and make sure I was putting in a lot more effort into the area I'd requested feedback on. And it also does help to keep track of your improvement in that area, specifically if you're building upon feedback that was raised in the previous piece of coursework, you can see you're improving if you've requested further feedback based on that. So my initial reaction to when I received the specific feedback was actually somewhat negative, but I think that this was largely down to receiving more feedback than usual, which wasn't something I'd really expected, I suppose. But when I did look over it, there was actually a lot of useful suggestions on how I could have improved. I'd requested feedback on how to better compare techniques I was discussing. So there was a lot of constructive comments on how I could better do that and link each technique to the report question. The specific feedback was also provided both on the feedback performer and also on the report. So there was a figure in the report, for example, that had a lot of suggestions on it, such as suggesting adding an additional figure that could have helped compare it to another technique I was discussing, which wasn't something I'd even considered. And there was also other suggestions about how the figure could have been better incorporated into the report. So some people in the class did have concerns about the specific feedback, however. Quite a few were concerned that by highlighting weaknesses that might have gone unnoticed, it could lead to the overall grade being lower than it would have otherwise been, which they didn't feel was fair. For me, receiving the feedback did initially give a sense of underperformance, which is because I'd put a lot of effort into the report, so it was fairly disheartening to receive more feedback than I had expected at first, although I did find it useful later on. And some people also did feel that they received too much specific feedback and that they maybe lost out on the general feedback covering the report as a whole. So we came up with a couple of suggestions on how to improve the process. Some students actually did want the specific feedback to be an option on all reports, not necessarily compulsory, but as an option for continued development if they wanted it. And we did also feel it would alleviate fears if there was further emphasis from the outset that specific feedback wouldn't have any impact on the grade. In report 3, most of the class didn't take up the option for the specific feedback. Personally, I was satisfied with my grade for the report 2, and I had addressed the issues that were raised in the feedback for that when writing report 3. So I didn't feel there was any new areas that I really wanted to focus on. Some other people in the class also didn't take up the option because of the previous concerns discussed about potentially unfair marking, or because they wanted a more general feedback that covered the whole report as well. Okay, so I'm just going to pass back to Maria now.
Okay, so I'll just give you our main conclusions. So overall, it looked like the fact that the students could identify aspects on which they did want feedback was overall beneficial. We did get the feeling from our analysis that stronger students perhaps have more insight or are more able or more willing to articulate their doubts when they're asking for the feedback. And potentially this also feeds into the fears associated with possible effects on the grade. It was really interesting for us that students thought we wouldn't notice a problem if the student hadn't actually highlighted it for us. So I think if we do this again, which we may well do, we might have to spend longer at the start to educate students into identifying their weaknesses and trying to reassure them that, you know, we're not going to, this process isn't going to make their grade any worse. So I guess that's all I wanted to say. So I think we'll be happy to take questions. I would like just to say that although James was a student presenting, I believe that 4 others of our students did have contributions into the student slides there. So thanks also to Tanya, Catherine, Anna, and Juti, who are scattered to the ends of the earth just now. So not all have good internet connection, and some of them are asleep in bed right now. So I will stop the share and, oh, hang on. I'll try and stop the share. Right, there we go. Okay.
So thank you very much indeed, colleagues, for again another really interesting presentation. I know that some of the questions that have come in you've been answering, because there's more than one of you you've been able to answer in the background while people have been talking, but there are some left that we could perhaps you could answer now. I'll leave it over to you. I think there's only 2 or 3 in there, but I'll leave it over to you to decide what you want to do.
So there's a question here on defining detailed and non-detailed feedback, and essentially the detailed feedback was of the sort that Saida showed, where the student had said something like, my previous feedback said that I should do X, Y, or Z, and I've tried to do that in this report. Can you tell me if I succeeded? Or the one that said, I've never done a figure or a table before, so I really don't know if I've succeeded in actually doing that. Whereas the non-detailed ones just said something like, can you give me feedback on my discussion? And it's not clear, you know, what aspect of their discussion would they like feedback on. So it was vague in the sense that you didn't really know what exactly they wanted to ask about. So that was the difference between the detailed and the non-detailed. Oh, I think that's the previous person.
There was another point in that question there as well about, did you demonstrate what it was, but did you demonstrate what detailed and non-detailed were prior to the students filling it out? But I think that's something we have really learned from this, as I think you mentioned in the conclusions, Maria, that is something we need almost to teach students how to do. I think we hadn't actually perhaps anticipated the very wide range of types of requests there would be. So I think that's something that's been a big learning point from it that we can take forward into next year, is to educate a bit more about what might be a useful feedback request for a student and what might not be a useful feedback request.
Yeah, I mean, I think we suggested to them that it might be something from a previous feedback that they wanted to show they'd worked on, or just something they weren't sure about. We did discuss the other day whether we should give them some examples of previous requests, but then we were wondering whether the students would look at that and think, oh, that's a good request. If I make a good request like that, that'll, you know, enhance my grade. You know, so it's kind of hard to know exactly what to do, but I think some more education is needed. Sorry, I'm just trying to look at these other questions.
I could speak a little bit about with the bottom one, about, so I'm just answering it. Any thoughts on how to support assessors in writing useful feedback? Do you ever struggle to extract meaningful feedback rather than vague comments from people who are trying to spend less time in teaching and more time in research? Just a brief comment on it from my own experience. I think one of the most helpful things we've done is to use the pro formas, which specifically they have things that the student has done well, things they can improve on, but they also address the learning outcomes, intended learning outcomes from the piece of coursework, and I think that has really helped me certainly to write more specific and useful feedback, is in telling the students how well they have addressed the learning outcomes, because hopefully that then needs to get that, will help them with their next assignment to look more closely at the learning outcomes to address them.
Okay, there's a question here about how important is optional versus mandatory participation. The first time we did it, we asked all students to submit a requested feedback at the start of so it will be the first thing in their essay or report. The second time it was optional. I think the view from the students was that they would prefer it to be optional. I do always worry about these things, though, that sometimes when things are optional, students just decide, oh, well, I won't bother with that. So maybe we'll go for something along the lines of making it expected for the second report and then optional after that, and see how that actually goes. But I mean, I agree that participation in anything that you do like this, some students get very involved and other students don't engage. And my feeling from what we've done just now is it's the students who are engaging less who are really the ones we want to target with this. So it's how you get those ones to engage, which is a big issue here. What else have we got? That's laptops. Is there a question I'm not seeing?
Somebody said when we did this in one of the labs where we asked students to look at previous assessment feedback and asked them to identify 3 points, we talked to them and gave them feedback on identifying their focus points. I think the concept of a dialogue, actually talking to students about them, is really interesting, because I know quite often our students do come back to us and ask to discuss individual points. I think our numbers wise, it has made it difficult to do feedback with every person as a spoken thing, but that was one of the points that was raised in the focus group, actually, was how useful they found it to talk about with staff. That was one of the other kind of themes that we haven't sort of had time to explore, that they found they wanted a dialogue on it, some of them, possibly the ones who were more engaged with it though.
Yeah, I mean, for the first report, which is actually a formative report, we do, after they've got that back, we have a personal development planning meeting at which going through the feedback on that first report is one of the things that we do with the students. After that, we tend to leave it optional for the students to contact us, although we're now putting into practice something we gained from somewhere else in the university, and I can't remember where. It might have been psychology, where they actually give the markers email address and a contact, please do contact us if you would like to discuss this further. And although it didn't seem to elicit any more requests for discussion than previously.
Okay, well, we seem to be managing brilliantly here. I don't quite know how we're doing this, but we're starting and finishing almost exactly on time. And that is almost exactly on time. So very well done, team. Thank you very much for a really interesting presentation, and thanks for those questions, everybody.